They named it Imperium Sinae Fine, an empire without limits or end. Yet beneath Rome's gleaming marble structures and timeless myths lies a history etched not in triumph, but in relentless bloodshed. This was no ordinary state. It was a relentless engine of conquest, fueled by fire, iron, and unyielding fear. Wherever Rome marched forward, opposition was not simply defeated, it was utterly wiped out. Entire cultures disappeared beneath the weight of its legions, their names erased from records, their cities burned to ashes and erased from memory. Rome's vast dominion reshaped the world, but at a cost that few dared to fully confront or reckon with. What we now remember as civilization, others lived through as devastation, and history has never forgotten those dark truths. In ancient Rome, crucifixion was the order of the day, also to resist. Rome was not only to risk death, but to invite a punishment designed to terrify and serve as a brutal lesson to thousands. Crucifixion was far more than mere execution. It was a form of merciless political theater. Known to the Romans as crux, this form of punishment stood as a towering and horrifying warning. To rebel was to be broken slowly, publicly, and without any mercy. Primarily inflicted on slaves, rebels, and the lowest ranks of society, crucifixion became a calculated instrument of fear and control during Rome's relentless expansion. The message was brutally clear: submission meant survival, resistance meant total obliteration. During the Third Servile War, the infamous slave rebellion led by Spartacus, Rome made an example so horrifying that it echoes through the centuries. After finally crushing the slave army in 71 BCE, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered the crucifixion of over 6,000 captured survivors along the Appian Way, the very road that led directly into the heart of the capital. Their bodies lined the highway for more than 100 miles, a grim and ghastly procession demonstrating Rome's absolute and terrifying dominance. The Roman historian Appian records how Crassus crucified them along the Appian Way, transforming the road into a chilling and unforgettable warning against any future uprisings. And it worked. No slave rebellion ever again reached the scale or threat of Spartacus's revolt. But this horrific punishment was not reserved only for Rome's enslaved. Any provincial uprising in Judea, Gaul, Britannia could end with mass crucifixions carried out not as acts of justice, but as public spectacles. Wooden posts were left standing upright in conquered cities, sometimes for months on end, serving as silent and terrifying threats. Crucifixion was not just an act of cruelty, it was imperial policy. Pain became propaganda, and in this, Rome perfected a form of psychological warfare that no conquered people could ever ignore: the destruction of Carthage. Few acts of Roman aggression embody such cold and final brutality as the complete destruction of Carthage. This was not simply a military victory, it was the total obliteration of a rival civilization, a deliberate erasure from history itself. Carthage, once a dominant maritime power, and the only force in the western Mediterranean capable of rivaling Rome, had already suffered defeat in 2 earlier wars. Yet Rome's appetite for victory was not satisfied. It sought more than mere triumph. It demanded absolute assurance that Carthage would never rise again. Under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, Rome laid siege to the city for over 2 grueling years. When Carthage finally fell, the destruction was total and merciless. Ancient historians such as Appian recount that the city burned for more than a week. Its inhabitants, men, women, and children, were either slaughtered or enslaved. The city itself was dismantled, stone by stone, until nothing remained. Much debate surrounds the tale that Roman soldiers sowed salt into the earth to curse the land with infertility. Modern scholars often regard this as apocryphal. Still, the symbolism endures. Rome did not simply defeat Carthage, It buried it, both metaphorically and literally, beneath the weight of its own supremacy. This brutal act reveals a chilling principle of Roman warfare. Some enemies were not meant to be subdued, but completely erased from history. Rome would not share the world. It would consume it, wiping out entire cities in Gaul with equal ruthlessness. When Julius Caesar turned his gaze northward toward Gaul in the mid-1st century BCE, he sought not just conquest, but transformation. Gaul, known to the Romans as a land of fiercely independent tribes, became the proving ground for one of the most relentless campaigns in Roman military history. Over nearly a decade, Caesar led his legions in a brutal expansion that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. Some cities simply ceased to exist. Perhaps the most notorious example is the siege of Avaricum in 52 BCE. Located in what is now central France, Avaricum resisted Roman control during the wider Gallic revolt led by the chieftain Vercingetorix. Caesar, whose Commentary de Bello Gallico remains our primary source, described Avaricum as the most beautiful city in all Gaul. But its beauty offered no protection. After a prolonged siege, the Roman legions breached the defenses, and what followed was systematic destruction. Caesar himself records that nearly the entire population of around 40,000 was slaughtered, sparing almost none. This was not an isolated incident. The Gallic Wars were marked by similar fates for towns that resisted too strongly or too long. Cities such as Cenabum, Noviodunum, and Uxellodunum were burned to the ground, depopulated, or enslaved wholesale, serving as grim reminders of Rome's unyielding dominance. Caesar deliberately implemented a policy of terror to crush revolts in Gaul. At Uxellodunum, he wrote that he cut off the hands of surrendering warriors, turning them into a living warning to others who might consider rebellion. These acts were not mere excesses of war or spontaneous cruelty. They were calculated demonstrations of Roman resolve and power designed to instill fear and obedience. By erasing entire urban centers, Caesar ensured that rebellion would not merely be punished, it would be rendered unthinkable. In Gaul, Rome was not simply building an empire, it was methodically stamping out any alternatives to its rule, one city at a time. Forced starvation was a key tactic in Roman siege warfare. Hunger was not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, but a deliberate and strategic weapon. Throughout both the Republic and Imperial eras, Roman commanders turned starvation into a tool as effective and feared as the sword itself. When a city defied Roman demands, it was not always assaulted immediately. Instead, it was often sealed off completely, its supply lines cut, and its people left to endure the slow, crushing pressure of famine. This tactic was deeply embedded in Roman military strategy. Denying access to food and water wore down both the morale and physical resistance of defenders, making conquest less costly and less bloody for Roman forces. The ancient historian Frontinus, in his work Stratagems, described this approach as a wise economy of blood, a method to subdue enemies without exhausting Roman strength unnecessarily. One of the most harrowing examples of this tactic comes from the siege of Numantia in Hispania. Between 134 and 133 BCE, the Numantines, a small but fiercely defiant Celtiberian people, refused to submit to Roman rule. In response, Scipio Aemilianus, the same general who had destroyed Carthage, encircled the city with a massive wall, cutting off all external resources and reinforcements. Inside, conditions rapidly deteriorated as no food remained and hope faded. Driven to desperation, the citizens ultimately chose self-destruction over surrender. Ancient sources describe mass suicides and fires set by the inhabitants themselves, preferring death on their own terms rather than falling into Roman hands. This brutal method was also employed during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Roman forces under Titus surrounded the city, and within weeks, starvation gripped the population. Josephus, a contemporary historian and eyewitness, recorded the immense suffering with restrained sorrow, noting that those who died from hunger were beyond counting. Roman siege tactics were not only military maneuvers, but psychological warfare. The message was clear and chilling. Resistance would not only bring the sword, but also the slow, agonizing erosion of life itself. Hunger became official policy, and waiting became its executioner. In the Roman worldview, conquest was never complete until the defeat had been made profitable. Enslavement on a massive scale was not merely a consequence of Roman victory, but a deliberate and integral part of Rome's imperial system, ensuring that the spoils of war enriched the state and reinforced its dominance. Rome's empire was built on a foundation of systemic brutality and economic exploitation, with slavery as a core feature. Cities that resisted Rome too fiercely or held out too long were often completely emptied of their populations. The inhabitants were sold into slavery, their forced labor financing future military campaigns and rewarding the legions that secured Rome's dominance. This was not random cruelty, but an organized, state-sanctioned policy that devastated conquered peoples. The Roman Republic and later the Empire developed one of the largest slave economies in history. Conquests across Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean provided a near-constant influx of captives. After the sack of Epirus in 167 BCE, the general Aemilius Paulus ordered the enslavement of 150,000 people.